Chapter 3, Buddhism. Here's an outline of Chapter 3. The first section deals with the life of the Buddha and the historical origin of the religion Buddhism. The next three sections, 3.2, 3.3, 3.4, talk about the Dharma or teaching of the Buddha, including a list of the Four Noble Truths, the three characteristics of conditioned existence or samsara, and more about the Buddhist teachings of karma and samsara. In section 3.5, we learn about the Sangha, or the order of monks established by the Buddha. Section 3.6 is about the early history of Buddhism, the first couple of centuries after the life of the Buddha. Sections 3.7 to 3.9 are about the three major divisions within Buddhism, the three main branches or types of Buddhism. Theravada is predominant in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia. Mahayana Buddhism is prominent in China, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. And Vajrayana Buddhism is the type most commonly practiced in Central Asia, like in Mongolia and also Tibet and also Nepal and Bhutan. Section 3.10 is about Buddhist practices around worship at temples, for example, and also about Buddhist festivals. Section 3.11 looks at the relation between Buddhism and fine arts like architecture and sculpture. Section 3.12 looks at the recent history of Buddhism of the last couple of centuries. Section 3.1, the Buddha. Buddhism began in what's known as the Middle Country, or what used to be called the Middle Country in the Veda and other ancient Indian texts. This is a reference to the middle reaches of the Ganges River Valley. The Ganges River flows from the Himalayan mountains in the north to the Bay of Bengal in the east and south. In ancient India, the Aryan kingdoms were spread throughout northern India. And the Middle Country was basically the center of their culture. So the Aryan kingdoms existed a little bit to the north, south, east, and west of the Ganges River Valley, but they were really centered along the Ganges River. It was in this area in the 500s BC, and maybe a little bit earlier, that the Shramana movement originated. The Shramanas are religious renunciates who renounce all of their wealth and worldly attachments, live a life of discipline, meditation, exposure to the elements for the sake of a spiritual goal. So this is including people who authored the Upanishads in Hinduism. There are many different sects and religions of Shramanas though, such as the ones who founded Jainism. And Buddhism grew out of that Shramana movement. That's why there are similarities in belief and practice between the Vedanta or Upanishads-based Hinduism, the religions Jainism and Buddhism. They all emerged out of this group of renunciates. On the map, you can see in red the main cities associated with the life of the Buddha. For example, the Buddha was born in Lumbini in the north, and he attained enlightenment in Bodh Gaya in the east. In Buddhism, they don't mainly worship God or the gods. Instead, the main object of worship or veneration is called the triple gem, Triratna. This refers to the Buddha, his Dharma or teaching, and the Sangha or order of monks. So in order to become a Buddhist, a person has a ritual or a ceremony where they take refuge in the triple gem. This is a reference to an ancient practice in which a person would take refuge in a lord. The lord, who would be typically a powerful noble, would be expected to provide protection for the person taking refuge in them. And the person taking refuge pledged their loyalty and support for the lord in exchange. This is the basic model for what it means to be a Buddhist, taking refuge in the Buddha. The triple gem is symbolized by a trident or trizula in Buddhism. This is a similar symbol to the one you see in Hinduism, but in Hinduism, the trizula is associated with the god Shiva. In Buddhism, it represents the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. You can also see on the image on the right a Vajra and Dharma chakra. Vajra means diamond or thunderbolt. According to tradition, Indra, the king of the gods, has a sword that's also as hard as a diamond and flashes like lightning. Buddhism actually believes that there are gods, devas, and that their king is Indra, who's also called Sakka in the Buddhist scriptures, or Shaka. You may notice there are different pronunciations of some of the Buddhist terms and different spellings because some of the scriptures are in Pali and others are in Sanskrit. But in any event, Indra is regarded as the king of the gods in Buddhism. He's not the main focus of the worship, though. Even though Buddhists believe in gods and goddesses, they mainly follow and worship the Buddha and his teaching because the gods are not regarded as all wise or all powerful. That's one of the main differences between Buddhism and Hinduism. They don't believe in a supreme being, Brahman, in Buddhism. So that's why they worship the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha instead. But the Vajra, which is the sword of Indra traditionally, is regarded as a symbol of spiritual power. So the Buddha or other awakened beings, they have a wisdom that gives them power. The Dharma chakra is a symbol of the Dharma or the teaching of the Buddha. It's a wheel with 12 spokes traditionally, which symbolize the Four Noble Truths in 3 aspects. 4 times 3 is 12. The 3 aspects of the Four Noble Truths are explained in the Buddha's first sutra or teaching, which is called the Discourse of the Turning of the Dharma Wheel. The Wheel of the Dharma is a symbol for the teaching of the Buddha. You'll also notice here that there are flower petals around the wheel. This is supposed to represent a lotus flower, which is a symbol of enlightenment or awakening in Buddhism. The story of the Buddha begins before his birth. Buddhism believes in reincarnation or rebirth. Before the Buddha was born in his final life, in which he became the Buddha, he had different incarnations or lives in which he was making the resolve to become a Buddha or awakened being in a future birth. A being who makes a resolve to become a Buddha and who has made significant progress on this path is called a bodhisattva in Buddhism. A Buddha is an awakened being who also teaches others how to become awakened. So in Buddhism, they believe that the Dharma is eternal. It's always been there, but it must be periodically rediscovered by beings after it's been lost or forgotten. And the beings who rediscover the Dharma and teach it to a whole world are called Buddhas. So in order to become a Buddha, you have to also develop a bunch of different perfections that are called paramitas. And the past lives of the Buddha that are collected in the Jataka Tales in the Buddhist scriptures are about the Buddha developing these perfections in his previous lives. The word Jataka just means a birth story, essentially. One example of a Jataka is when the Buddha was born as King Vesantara. This king made a vow to practice generosity to perfection. Anytime someone would ask him to give something, he would give it. He gave away all the wealth of his kingdom, including the royal elephant, which is a symbol of the power and authority of the king. This actually angered his subjects, who thought it was beneath his dignity to give away the elephant. This symbolizes both the high degree of generosity you need to become awakened in Buddhism, but also the fact that there's a distinction between the values of a Buddha and the values of the world. So people in the world may be attached to possessions or attached to a kind of pride and not willing to give things up. The Jataka Tales are often used in Buddhism to illustrate moral examples like parables. The Buddha's last life was one where he was born with the name Siddhartha Gautama. The term Buddha is actually a title. It was not his name. It means an awakened being. When he was born, he was given the name Siddhartha by his parents. This actually is from the Sanskrit words Siddha and Artha. Siddha means power, and Artha means success. So his parents may have given him that name because they wanted him to have great power and success in the world, actually. And his family name is Gautama, so that's why that's his last name. Another term for the Buddha is Shakya Muni. Muni means sage in Sanskrit, which is a wise person. And Shakya was the name of the larger tribe or clan that he was a part of. Buddhists traditionally give the years 563 to 483 BC as the dates of the Buddha's lifespan. Modern scholars estimate he probably lived mostly in the 5th century or 400s BC, but they do generally accept that he lived to about 80 years of age, which is what was recorded in the Pali Canon. The Pali Canon is the oldest surviving complete set of Buddhist scriptures, And much of the information in there about the life of the Buddha is believed to be basically accurate or probably accurate. The problem is that the Buddha does not give many details from his own life. There isn't a lot of autobiography in the Pali Canon. It's mainly just records of teachings that the Buddha gave at particular times or places. Later Buddhists developed longer, more detailed biographies. An example is Ashvaghossa's Buddha Charita. One thing about these biographies, though, is that even though they're mostly believed by Buddhists today, they do contain legendary elements, things that are probably not factually or historically correct. One of the ways we know this is in places where they contradict the Pali Canon. So one example of that, in the Pali Canon, the Buddha says that when he decided to leave home to become a religious renunciate, his parents saw him do that and they were crying as he cut his hair. In the Buddha Charita, a more dramatic story is told where the Buddha had to sneak out from his palace under the cover of darkness because his father would not have given him permission to leave. So it's an example of how the legendary biographies are more maybe exciting or dramatic, but probably less historical than what you see in the Pali Canon. Siddhartha was born in the village of Lumbini. He was born into the tribe of the Shakyas. The Shakyas controlled a small kingdom or region in what's now northern India and southern Nepal in the foothills of the Himalayan mountains. So he was born in the rains month, which is called Vaishaka, and this month still is used to celebrate the birthday of the Buddha by Buddhists. The Vaishaka or Vesak holiday is the most important holiday in Buddhism. The Buddha was born into the Kshatriya Varna, which you may remember from our study in Hinduism is the Varna of nobles and warriors. So he had a privileged upbringing. Later biographies portray him as being an extremely wealthy, powerful prince, and his father as being an extremely wealthy and powerful king. This is likely an exaggeration. So it's possible that the Shakya territory was ruled by a kind of council or assembly of the elder members of the Kshatriya Varna who lived there. However, it is true that the Buddha had a privileged upbringing. He describes living a life of utmost refinement in the Pali Canon, such as having the best types of clothing and having multiple residences where he could spend different times of the year and being served by other people. His family is called Gautama, and his father's name was Suddhodana. His mother's name is Mahamaya. His mother died when he was relatively young, so he was also partially raised by his stepmother. When he was a young man, he married. His wife was named Yasodhara, and he had a son named Rahula. He decided to leave home after already having been married and having a son. So he would have been a young man by the time he left home, probably around the age of 30. This is a custom that was followed by some people in ancient India to go on a spiritual quest. It may seem odd from the modern perspective that the Buddha was abandoning, in a sense, his wife and young child, but they become his students later and he helps them attain awakening. So most Buddhists do not regard this as being problematic. Instead, the way they look at it is he was actually helping his family by discovering the path to awakening, which he could then teach to his family members. So his son became a monk and his wife and stepmother actually became nuns who followed him as well. Now, it may not surprise you, this is not a historical photograph of the Buddha. Rather, it's a picture from a pageant depicting his life, which I believe took place in Burma. So it's a common custom in Buddhist countries around the birthday of the Buddha to have these kind of pageants that basically depict the life and ministry of the Buddha. After Siddhartha was a young man, he was living this refined lifestyle, he became disenchanted with the life he was living. In the Pali Canon, the Buddha just says that when he was young, when he was healthy, when he was full of life, he one day came upon the realization that eventually he would get sick, grow old, and die. So he had a kind of, originally an intoxication, as he puts it, with youth, health, and life. But when he realized the impermanence of these things, that eventually he would get sick, he would grow old, he would die, his privilege would not protect him from those, he went upon a spiritual quest. He decided to search for a higher goal, how to end suffering and kind of attain a goal that was not going to be harmed by sickness, old age, and death. The way this is told in the legendary biographies is more dramatic. Siddhartha's father had heard a prophecy, or an astrological forecast actually, when Siddhartha was born, that said that either he would become a great king or a great religious teacher. His father was a noble king and did not want his son to become a religious teacher. He preferred that Siddhartha become a great ruler. So he actually protected his son from any exposure to any of the negative aspects of a worldly existence. He didn't let him see old people or sick people, and he gave his son no knowledge of death. According to the legendary biography, Siddhartha was able to escape outside the palace one day with his charioteer. You can see there in the picture. And the gods arranged it so that he would see a old man, a sick man, and a dead man, a corpse, so that he could realize the impermanent nature of material reality. The fourth thing that he saw was a Shramana, someone who renounced the world for the sake of attaining a higher spiritual goal. In any event, both in the Pali Canon and the legendary version, this realization of the impermanence of youth, health, and life inspired Siddhartha to depart from home and set upon the goal of attaining enlightenment, basically, or liberation. He did not immediately find the path on his own. Instead, he became a student of other spiritual teachers. These are named in the Pali Canon, and they are Alara Kalama and Uddaka Ramaputta. These are people who taught Siddhartha different meditation techniques. And according to the Pali Canon, Siddhartha completely mastered their teachings, but realized that the meditation just gave him the ability to attain temporary states of mind, in which his mind was temporarily not suffering and calm, but did not permanently transform his consciousness in a way that would be equivalent to moksha or awakening. So he decided to leave these teachers and go off on his own. When he left his teachers, he entered upon a period of intense renunciation or austerity. So this is similar to what's practiced by the authors of the Upanishads and by ancient Jains and other Shramanas. He fasted for long periods. He controlled his breath by stopping his in and out breaths until he appeared dead, as he puts it. And he tried to crush his mind with awareness to control his thoughts. When he was engaging in these more extreme forms of asceticism, he met up with 5 other Shramanas that are called the 5 hermits in Buddhism, and they were trying to encourage each other in the practice of extreme austerities like fasting for many days or weeks. The Buddha gives a vivid description of what his body looked like after fasting for such a long period. He says that you could see the vertebrae of his spine as if they were pearls on a thread. He compares his abdomen to the inner side of the hoof of a camel, so it was so shrunken out and hollowed out. What he discovered, though, was despite pushing these austerities as far as he could physically go, he did not attain awakening. The idea behind the austerities seems to be that if you inflict bodily pain or discomfort on yourself, you can transcend attachment to your body and thus attain moksha, liberation, or nirvana that way. Nirvana is the term used in Buddhism to refer to the ultimate spiritual goal. We'll get back to that in one second. However, he realized the austerities were not allowing him to attain awakening. He was just becoming weak physically, and it actually interfered a bit with his meditation. So he decided on his own initiative to break the fast, to eat a little food, and to recover his physical strength. He was able to break the fast when a layperson gave him some rice porridge. In Indian culture, there's a belief that if you give a donation of food to a spiritual seeker, that's basically good karma for you. And that's partly the reason why that's such a widespread custom even today. After Siddhartha broke his fast, he made a resolution to sit under a fig tree and meditate and either attain awakening or die trying. This resolution was inspired by a memory he had of when he was a child, sitting under an apple tree. He was looking at his father work in a field, and he spontaneously attained a state of calm absorption called dhyana in Buddhism. This is a state of mind that can happen either spontaneously or through deliberate meditation practice, in which your mind is focused yet calm, and your defilements, the parts of your mind that are causing suffering, temporarily go away. What the Buddha realized here was that the pleasant features of dhyana were not harmful. So there was something defective about his previous spiritual path in which he was trying to inflict pain upon himself for the sake of awakening. The idea that he realized now was that certain pains can be a part of the path to awakening, but so are certain pleasures. There is nothing harmful or problematic about the pleasure of dhyana, or a concentrated state of mind. So the pleasures of dhyana are safe and pure, unlike the pleasures of the senses, like the pleasures of sex or of eating or drinking. So with this new insight, he decided to sit and meditate under the fig tree. The tree under which the Buddha was meditating became known as the Bodhi tree, or tree of awakening, because he did succeed in attaining Bodhi or awakening while sitting under the tree. The picture on the right is at the place in India where the Buddha was believed to have attained awakening. It's called Bodh Gaya. It's named after the Bodhi or awakening that he attained there. The tree in the picture is not the actual one the Buddha sat under, but it's believed by Buddhists to be a descendant of that tree. And Bodh Gaya is one of the main pilgrimage centers of Buddhism in India. So, in order to attain awakening, the Buddha had to go through what are called the 4 dhyanas. So in Buddhism, they have a doctrine of an organized sequence of stages of concentration you can go through. And when you go through these stages, it will tend to give you greater knowledge and insight, which can eventually culminate in attaining awakening. Now, you can actually get to all 4 dhyanas and not necessarily attain awakening right away. But when you kind of perfect your practice of the 4 dhyanas, that's when you can attain awakening. As the Buddha went through these 4 states of concentration, he first attained what are called the divine knowledges, or abhinyas. These include the ability to see into his past lives. He was also able to see into the past lives of others and how their karma or actions could determine what they experienced in each of their lives. So he was able to see the whole pattern of karma and how it works itself out in samsara. After he attained the divine knowledges, he attained special powers that are called siddhis. These are basically miraculous or psychic powers, including things like the ability to walk on water, the ability to fly through the air, the ability to project appearances of himself in other places at once, and the ability to create a kind of spirit or astral body that can fly through space and appear and interact with other beings in other parts of samsara. So after he attained these powers, he attained what's regarded as most important in Buddhism, which is the transcendent wisdom of awakening. Wisdom is called prajna in Buddhism. And the wisdom that allows you to attain awakening is called the 4 Noble Truths. This is basically the ultimate insight into suffering, the cause of suffering, the fact that there's an end of suffering, and how to bring about that end. And the idea is you'll only perfect your understanding of the 4 Noble Truths once you attain awakening. When he had attained awakening, or as he was just about to, a demonic being named Mara appeared to try to tempt the Buddha and get him off his resolve to attain awakening. Mara is a figure in Buddhism similar to Satan in Christianity or Islam, and that he tries to tempt people away from salvation. However, Mara is operating here through 2 different levers, lust and fear. He first manifests before the Buddha a bunch of his daughters who are engaging in an erotic, sexy dance to try to arouse the Buddha's lust, but he fails to do so. Then he tries to frighten the Buddha with an army of demons who are about to attack him. But similarly, he's not frightened by this army. And instead, the Buddha gestures down towards the earth to serve as witness for what he has attained, the level of wisdom he has accomplished. You can see in this image on the right, it shows the Buddha and Mara's demon army on the left side of the picture. On the right side of the picture is a goddess named Pramaitarani. This is an earth goddess. or one of the names of the earth goddess in Buddhism. She's sometimes also just called Bu, B-H-U, but the belief is that as a form of witness to the Buddha's attainments, she actually wrung out her wet hair after she had bathed, and there was so much water in her hair, because she is the earth after all, that it sufficed to completely wash away the army of Mara. And basically, this is representing the fact that a Buddha is someone who's immune to temptation or fear or other types of any type of mental weakness. The state of an awakened being is called Bodhi, and it's basically the same concept or similar to Nirvana. So Bodhi is the state of awakening. Nirvana can either be a reference to that state or to the reality that you experience when you're awakened. Nirvana is believed to be a kind of unconditioned eternal realm where there's perfect awareness and no suffering. And that could be used both to describe the state of mind or awareness of an awakened being, but also can be used to describe the reality that they experience. So nirvana is already there, even if people have not awakened to it. After the Buddha attains awakening, he first is just enjoying the bliss of awakening for several days. He considers the possibility of teaching this to others, but initially he decides against it because he thinks that some parts of the teaching are so difficult to understand that most beings he teaches will not be able to benefit from it. So when he's thinking these thoughts, there's a divine being called Brahma Sahampati who is able to read his mind, and the Brahma Sahampati appears before the Buddha to try to persuade him to teach. In Buddhism, they do believe in many different types of gods and goddesses. So previously I mentioned Indra, the king of the gods, the earth goddess, and now we have Brahma Sahampati. So this is like the god Brahma in Hinduism. The difference is that in addition to one creator god, Brahma, who the Buddhists also believe in, they believe in a larger class of Brahmas. So there's more than one god who's called Brahma. Brahma, in this case, is a kind of title for this divine being. So they're a different class of gods, unlike the Devas. But the Brahma Sahampati, like other gods, does have the psychic power of reading minds. When he appears before the Buddha, he says, basically, even though most beings will not be able to attain complete awakening by listening to your dharma or teaching, some will, and moreover, many beings will get at least some benefit from the dharma. And so for these reasons, you should teach. The Buddha agrees with him and decides to teach the dharma out of compassion for all beings. He first decides to try to teach this to his teachers, Alara Kalama and Uddaka Ramaputta, but he realizes through his psychic power basically that they've already died. So then he decides to teach this to the 5 hermits that he had left behind after he broke his fast. And he can use also his psychic power to figure out where the hermits have journeyed to, and he decides to walk towards them. This takes a number of days. He meets them in a place called Sarnath, where he gives them the first sutra or discourse of Buddhism. And in this sutra, he outlines the 4 noble truths, which are the reality of suffering, the cause of suffering, which is craving, the fact that suffering can be brought to an end, but only if craving is abandoned, and then the path you have to develop in order to abandon craving and bring about the end of suffering. He also taught the middle way, which is the idea that you want to avoid self-torture, excessively painful austerities on the one hand, like fasting to the point of death, but you also want to avoid indulgence in sense pleasure. So the middle way of Buddhism involves being strategic in which pains or pleasures you allow yourself to experience. And the Buddha taught the Dharma for around 40 years until his death. The event of the Buddha's death is known as the Parinirvana. You can see it depicted in this image. Images of the Buddha where he's lying on his side mainly depict the Parinirvana. According to the Pali Canon, the Buddha foresaw that he would die, and he actually made this as a conscious decision to leave his body. So when you're an awakened being or Buddha, you're not going to be reborn in samsara, according to Buddhism. You will still exist in a way after the death of your last body, but because you've eliminated all karma, you still are aware and make decisions, but you're not causing any type of impure karma that would cause you to be reborn in samsara, your awareness will be totally freed of any body after death. However, the Buddha also is depicted as having some kind of control over the timing of his death, so it's portrayed as the result of a decision he makes. He's completed his teaching of the Dharma. There's nothing more he can add to it. It's perfect. So now he's going to let go of his last body and leave samsara. However, there is a physical cause of his death, which is that the last meal that's given to him by a pious layperson, a silversmith named Chunda, is tainted. It causes him to get sick and die. So an awakened being, after the death of their last body, is in a state called Parinirvana. This is like a continuation of nirvana because it's an end of all suffering and an end of all craving or other defiled states of mind. But the difference between nirvana and parinirvana is that you can experience nirvana while you're still alive in the body, whereas parinirvana is only something you experience after the death of your last body. The Buddha says that you cannot really describe what it's like to experience parinirvana. He instead describes it with the so-called fourfold negation. After attaining parinirvana, an awakened being, which is called a Tathagata, neither exists, nor not exist, nor both, nor neither. This is basically a way of saying that you cannot characterize verbally what it's like to experience awakening. It's not regarded as complete annihilation, but nor is it the same as having your usual self just persisting into the afterlife. It's something else. The word Tathagata literally means a being who's gone over there to the other side, and that's a reference to the other side of samsara. After the death of the Buddha, his body was cremated. This is the ritual that's performed by Buddhists after death, similar to what's performed by Hindus. Even though Buddhists do not acknowledge the authority of the Veda, they do follow a similar practice to the Veda of a cremation ritual. There was actually a fight that broke out among different groups of followers of the Buddha, including different kings, over who should get his mortal remains. On the one hand, Buddhists believe that the consciousness or awareness of the Buddha is totally outside of samsara. He's attained parinirvana, so it's not like his ghost is still haunting his remains or anything. But there's also a belief that you should honor the remains of a Buddha or other awakened being as a way of expressing your reverence for the Buddha and his teaching. So, and for that reason, all of these different Buddhists wanted to be able to have the remains so they could show their respect for them. This fight was about to break out in war, but then there was a Brahmin, a priest, who acted as a judge between the fighting or disagreeing parties. The Brahmin was named Drona. Even though he was a follower of the Buddha, he was born into the Brahmin caste. And the Brahmins were regarded as people who knew the law or who could serve as judges. Buddhism actually rejects the caste system of Hinduism, but especially the Buddhists in ancient India were still kind of affected by it in terms of just the way society functioned. Drona's solution was to divide the remains into 8 parts. And some of these parts were actually not the physical remains of the Buddha, but his begging bowl and the robe that he wore. So all of these remains were under different burial mounds or stupas. In ancient India, it was the custom for a very powerful king to be buried under a mound of dirt that would serve as kind of like a marker for his grave. And in Buddhism, the stupas are still used to this day as sites of pilgrimage and worship. There are more than 8 though now, because a later Buddhist king named Ashoka actually dug up the initial relics and divided them into smaller parts so there could be more stupas in different parts of India. Here is one of the stupas called Sanchi Stupa in the modern Indian state of Madhya Pradesh. So you can see it's like a large hemispherical mound that's been covered with stone. When Buddhists worship at the stupa, they will circumambulate it, which means to walk around it in a clockwise fashion.